going on, everybody? Not a long intro today. Just wanted to point out that I have done two previous redrafts in this series, the 2010 and 2011 CFL drafts. So go check that out under my channel. I have a playlist labeled CFL Redrafts, and be sure to check that out after you watch this one. Thanks, guys. Let's just get right into the CFL redraft, and I'm just going to talk about a couple of the criteria that I have to select these reselections in this redraft. First and foremost, I'm not really considering positional need at the time that these teams made those selections. It would just be too much of a headache to go back and look at the rosters and the needs that each team had at that given time. So I'm going basically the best player available method, as I did in the previous two videos of this series. And secondly, I consider positional value when it's really close between two players in this redraft process. And without further ado, let's start at the top of the draft, where the Saskatchewan Roughriders had the number 1 overall pick, and they took offensive lineman Ben Heenan out of Saskatchewan. He played in the league for a couple of seasons and was a consistent starter for this team, but he ultimately went to the NFL in 2015, and he actually tore his meniscus in training camp down there and ultimately retired pretty soon after. So he never came back to the CFL, despite having 3 very productive seasons with the Rough Riders. And so he's not the pick in this redraft to go number 1 overall. Instead, I'm going with Iowa State defensive lineman Cleon Lang, who was originally selected in the 2nd round, 9th overall by the Toronto Argonauts. In addition to being one of the handful of players in this draft that are still active in the CFL, he's been a really disruptive player throughout his entire career, been one of the most dominant players in this draft class, probably the most dominant, and that's why he's going number 1 for me in this redraft. 4 divisional all-star appearances, and he's still a starting caliber player all these years later. At number 2, the BC Lions were on the clock, and they picked defensive lineman from Eastern Michigan, Jabbar Westerman, who really didn't do too much in the league, never really established himself as a full-time CFL starter. So that's really not what you're looking for when you have one of these high picks in the CFL draft. So instead, I'm going to take another defensive lineman, and this guy is from Acadia, Jake Thomas, who originally went in the 4th round, 29th overall. Thomas is still active in the CFL as a full-time CFL starter with the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, just helped that team win back-to-back Grey Cups, and has just been a really consistent contributor to that team over the years. He was one of the biggest steals in recent memory in the CFL draft, again going in the 4th round here, so just incredible rise up the draft charts in this redraft. At number 3, the Winnipeg Blue Bombers selected offensive lineman Tyson Pencer from Washington State. Pencer hung around in the CFL for a handful of seasons, but never really made a big impact in terms of being a starter in the league. So he's definitely not the pick in this redraft. Instead, we're going to go with defensive back Courtney Stephen from Northern Illinois, who was selected in the 2nd round, 8th overall. Stephen played from 2012 to 2019 in the league, mostly with the Hamilton Tiger-Cats, where he was a consistent starter at the safety position and really played that role very capably for a number of years for a lot of really good Hamilton Tiger-Cats defenses. So he was an easy selection, especially in a position that has become more and more important to fill at the CFL level. I think Stephen is the easy pick here. At number 4, the Edmonton Eskimos were on the clock, and they at the time took offensive lineman Austin Pastor from Virginia. Pastor is one of those draft picks that just never ended up coming to the CFL. He ended up staying down in the NFL for a number of years before ultimately retiring. Ultimately, in this redraft, you got to go somewhere else with this pick, and we're going to go with offensive lineman Mike Filer out of Mount Allison, who went in the 5th round, 31st overall, so a huge steal. Filer was a very consistent player for the Hamilton Tiger-Cats, often starting at that center position, and was starting all the way up into the 2019 season, ultimately retired before 2021, but an excellent career, and I think you have to say he was the best offensive lineman in this draft class, despite going all the way in the 5th round. At number 5, the Calgary Stampeders took defensive lineman Amit Paul out of Wofford University, and Paul really didn't do much in the league at all, played a career high of 7 games in one season, and just really didn't make much of an impact at all from that defensive line spot. So we're going somewhere else again here, and we're going to go again to the defensive line with Justin Capiscotti from Simon Fraser University, who went in the 2nd round, 14th overall. Capiscotti probably has the weirdest career arc in this entire draft class, because for a couple years there, he was a legitimate star with the Ottawa Redblacks with 11 sacks in 2014, and then 12 sacks in 2015. But other than that, his career high in sacks in a season was 7, and then after that, only 3. Couple seasons where he didn't have any sacks at all, where he really wasn't much of a factor as a player. So, that really is what drags him down to number 5 in this redraft. But because of the high-end performance, I have to put him above guys that had longer longevity and perhaps more consistency in the league because, again, he was an all-star twice in his career. At number 6, Edmonton had another first-round pick, and they took wide receiver Shamad Chambers out of Laurier. Ultimately, he really wasn't all too impressive throughout the years, just not very much high-level production, a decent 5 receiver that you could put out on a CFL field. So he's not going to be my pick at number 6 in this redraft. I'm going with linebacker Sam Hurl from Calgary, who was selected in the 2nd round, 12th overall. Hurl played from 2012 to 2019 with the Rough Riders and the Blue Bombers, 4 times having 35 or more defensive tackles in a season, a lot of times also being a very impactful special teams player, a couple times being among the league leaders in special teams tackles. So a very consistent career and long career from Sam Hurl earns him a spot at number 6 in this redraft. At number 7, the BC Lions took offensive lineman Kirby Fabian from the University of Calgary. Fabian had a 6-year CFL career, but ultimately only was a full-time starter only twice in his career. So we're going to go elsewhere with this pick. So at number 7, we're going to go with offensive lineman Ben Heenan out of Saskatchewan, who again went 1st overall to the Saskatchewan Roughriders, only having those 3 years of high-level play. It was really hard to place him in this redraft because ultimately his career ended due to injuries, right? Who knows, he could have came back to the CFL and made even more of an impact. But in those 3 years he played, the Roughriders won a Grey Cup, and he played a really crucial part along that offensive line in doing so. So I think that buys him above a guy like Kirby Fabian or other offensive linemen in this draft class that had longer careers because he was a more consistent player in the short time that he spent in the league. At number 8, the Hamilton Tiger Cats were on the clock, and they took defensive back Courtney Stephen from Northern Illinois. And Stephen, of course, went number 3 in our redraft here, so he's not available for us to take. We're going to go with offensive lineman and a familiar name, Kirby Fabian from the University of Calgary, who again went the pick before this one at number 7 overall. And again, I think Fabian had a really solid CFL career playing those 6 seasons. That's a pretty good career length in the CFL, and the fact that he dressed and started a lot of games in the league, I think has a lot of value. So I think he's one of the better offensive linemen to come out of this draft class. At number 9, the Toronto Argonauts took defensive lineman Cleon Lang, who went 1st overall in our redraft. So obviously we're not taking him again here. At number 9, instead, we're going to go with offensive lineman Brad Erdos out of Simon Fraser, who went in the 4th round, 27th overall, so another big steal here. Erdos was a great guy for the Stampeders throughout his career that could potentially start when they needed him to, but he was perfectly fine in a backup role as well. Played with the Stampeders his entire career and was actually a full-time starter. The one season he played and started every game was actually their 2018 Grey Cup year. So he had a really solid career, and that's why he earns the number 9 spot in this redraft. And then finally, our last pick in the redraft, the Hamilton Tiger Cats took linebacker Frederick Plessius out of Laval. Plessius, believe it or not, is one of a handful of players in this draft class that is still active in the CFL today. He is currently with the Montreal Alouettes, but he's been really inconsistent player throughout his career. He's been in and out of the lineup. He's just kind of appeared in games when teams have needed him. Never really been a starting caliber player. So ultimately, he's not going to go number 10 in this redraft just because he never really made an impact in started CFL games. So we're going to go with wide receiver Shamad Chambers out of Laurier instead. He was selected in the 1st round, 6th overall, as we mentioned before. And Chambers, again, like I said before as well, he was probably the best skill player to come out of this draft. And I think if things had gone a little bit differently, I think he could have been a much more productive player at the CFL level. Is a player that his numbers really didn't show how impact of the plays that he was making in a lot of games. So ultimately, I think he's earned this number 10 selection in this redraft. But with that said, that is going to be the end of the 2012 CFL redraft, and it's always fun to look back at these draft classes years later and really see what players really turned out for teams, especially in the CFL draft where you see such a range in terms of where you find the best players in the draft. It's always interesting to look back on. You guys will have to let me know in the comment section if you agree with my selections. And with that said, I actually have something to debut for you guys that stuck around to the end. Just check out the end credits here, and with that said, I'll see you guys next time. Peace.